You always receive what you want, invariably, even when you believe it's entirely opposed to your wishes. If it's your karma, to put it another way, everything that happens to you is a return of what flows from you. Now, obviously, that sounds absurd if you confine your definition of yourself to your voluntary, conscious behavior. That's a ridiculously narrow definition. Any meaningful conception of yourself must involve far more than the conscious and voluntary aspects of your behavior. It must include, intimately and inescapably, the behavior of what we call the other, the not-self, the environment. When you see that these two are moving together, like the two sides of a snake when it swims, you get a very curious feeling. But you have to be careful if you come from a Western background. Because here's what happens to many people who experiment with psychedelic substances, inflation. They experience this sensation that the inside and outside of the world are moving together, and they think, I am ruling it. I am God, in the Western sense of that word. So their ego, instead of being integrated and transcended within this process, merely assumes vast dimensions. Megalomania. The ego gets inflated by the mystical experience, and you get the holier-than-thou people wandering around who seem to think they're above all human conventions, who have no obligations to anyone or anything because they're divine and can do as they damn please. What they haven't realized is this: doing as you will isn't some new behavior you suddenly adopt. You have to realize first that this is what you've always been doing. Today we're exploring one of the most challenging ideas in Eastern philosophy, that everything happening to you is your own doing, your own karma, and what this actually means when properly understood. This could fundamentally transform how you understand free will, responsibility, and your relationship to reality itself. This channel exists for those seeking philosophical depth and psychological insight into consciousness, karma, and authentic existence. If these explorations resonate with you, consider subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing your reflections in the comments. What we're examining today might radically shift how you perceive choice, control, and causation. Let's look at this from a simple point of view, not a complete one, but a useful starting place. What about people who did good things, who did things they didn't want to do? Everyone's mother said to us, darling, sometimes we have to do things we don't like. What about that? Well, you can always say the child obeyed the mother and did the thing it didn't like because that was the better part of wisdom. In other words, if they hadn't done that, something worse would have happened. We choose the lesser of two evils. When you find yourself in a situation where you must choose the lesser of two evils, you say, I want out of here, and you take the easiest way. You take the line of least resistance. So you're doing what you want even then. But you can pursue this more profoundly when you stop thinking about human behavior as something that responds to the compulsion of an environment. You can get out of that framework when you see the behavior of the environment as an essential aspect of you. It isn't the environment starting something which you are therefore compelled to follow. It's the whole system moving together. In the state of liberated or mystical consciousness, you very often feel that a hill is lifting you up as you walk up it. The ground seems to heave beneath your feet, and up you go. You get the strange feeling of lightness, of effortlessness, walking on air, never a care. This wonderful sense that there are no obstructions anywhere, nothing banging you and making you do anything. It all flows together. That's a very common sensation. In that state of consciousness, you are perceiving the going on, the Tao, the course of nature in the way it's actually happening. But in the ordinary state, you've been conditioned to resist it, to fight it, and to use those sensations of resistance to create a sensory basis for what you describe as the ego. The ego in practice is a sense of strain. When you are aware of I, you are aware of a basic discomfort located somewhere between the eyes, a sort of tightness. It's also in other centers, the solar plexus and various physical locations, where this constant tension or resistance is going on. That's what you feel when you talk about I. When that tension ceases, you discover immediately that the separate ego has disappeared, and that what I refers to is simply the total panorama of experience, everything that's happening. Obviously, I don't know all of it, because I can't inspect all of it with my conscious attention. That would be a ridiculous undertaking, to know everything in that limited sense. We know it in a much better way, the way we know how to grow hair and open and close our hands. This point of view can be understood if we clarify the initial problems we have about it. The first problem, if we accept the notion that everything that happens to us is our own karma, our own doing, then we must be very careful of the devil of omnipotence, of inflation, of feeling that your ego is what controls all this. The second problem: if you think that everything that happens to everybody is what they really wanted to happen, then you might absolve yourself from any qualms about being unkind to someone. You could say, well, the unkindness I did you was what you really wanted, wasn't it? There's that troubling business about the responsibility of the person who gets murdered for getting murdered. There is a curious sense in which many people go around looking for trouble. Freud correctly pointed out the psychology of accident-prone individuals. They seem to attract trouble like lights attract moths. We're all doing that, but we manage to remain unconscious of it so we can play the game of praise and blame. That's not my fault, that's your fault. We go around apportioning fault to everybody. Because if we're going to apportion praise for the good things people do, you can't make praise mean anything unless you also apportion blame. Praise and blame go together. Suppose everybody acted in a praiseworthy way and we praised everyone for everything. They'd get tired of it. They wouldn't even notice it anymore. So long as you're going to get a kick out of being praised, you've got to go around blaming too. It's very simple. But if you see the folly of that praising and blaming are just creating each other, then you don't praise and you don't blame. You just dig the whole thing. That's why when we encounter very great sages, you never hear them blame people. They very rarely praise anyone. Try to start gossip in the presence of such a person. Make a derogatory comment about someone. It's as if you had thrown a rock into a well and heard no splash. A funny feeling, because you get no response, no agreement. If you praise somebody, there's also likely nothing to be said, except perhaps some remark that, of course, you're praising the beloved in all its manifestations. This disconcerts some people terribly. I've always noticed that real sages never gossip, never criticize persons, because they understand so well the French saying, tout comprendre c'est tout pardonner, to understand all is to forgive all. If you're experienced in just the ordinary way of dealing with human problems, if you've been a counselor or psychotherapist or minister or anything like that, you very soon realize how vastly complicated people are. You see that they really are in the messes they're in, not because of anything, except that's the way it is. You stop blaming people. And because you don't blame people, you have open ears, and people come seeking your advice. They don't want to come to someone who will bawl them out. It's like dentists who simply accept the fact that people really don't take care of their teeth. They realize that the job of a dentist is precisely to look after people who can't be bothered to take care of their teeth. That's why they're in business. So a good dentist doesn't bawl patients out for not doing this or that. They just accept it. Same with doctors. They know perfectly well that nobody's going to live by the rules of health, and they're very vague as to what those rules even are. There's every kind of theory about how you ought to live, what is healthy, but they change with fashion. You ought to eat this kind of diet in 1921. By the time it's 1930, they've changed their ideas altogether. By 1960, it's back again to a mixture between 1921 and 1894 or something like that. It's always changing. While the rules are not entirely absurd, if they were all absurd, it would be easy. There's some truth in them always. Nobody's ever quite sure. So the function of healers and doctors is just to do what can be done to stop the mess from getting too messy. They must accept that that's their job. If I were healthy, you say to the doctor, I wouldn't need you. So you're in business. Now, what about it? If you're resonating with these ideas about karma, responsibility, and the nature of the self, I've created an ebook called Beyond the Shadow that explores Carl Jung's core psychological concepts. It examines the unconscious mind, shadow integration, and the individuation process, all of which relate directly to how we create our own reality unconsciously. If you're serious about this inner work, you'll find the link in the description. We have difficulty seeing this mutuality of our relationship to the rest of the world because it's contrary to common sense, contrary to the way we've been brought up. Therefore, we have what I would call an initial intellectual block to understanding it, quite apart from any emotional blocks. Obviously, we must overcome that intellectual block if we're going to go any further and actually realize and feel this way of life working, this relationship between what you do and what happens to you. Then the question arises, what do I do? Do I go around saying to myself, all this that's happening to me is what I wanted? I am inside and outside. I am the subjective and I am the objective. Do I go around thinking thoughts about this to talk myself into this way of feeling? Well, that's very superficial, because this new sense of relationship to nature is something much more than an idea. Ecologists and physicists have the idea that this is so, but they mostly, in their private life and ordinary human behavior are just like other people who don't feel it, who feel themselves in a Newtonian billiard game, even though they've gone on to quantum mechanics. There may be a transition from our ordinary way of feeling how things go on to the new way, but we have to do something other than think, because actually thinking is causing the trouble. It is by thinking that we divide the world into separate events and separate things. That is calculus. Ananda Kumaraswamy once described the life of the liberated being as a perpetual, uncalculated life in the present. You say, wow, I don't think I could do that. That saying of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, be not anxious for the morrow, the uncalculated life. If God so clothed the grass of the field, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? I've never met a preacher yet who would really take that up. They all say, well, of course that's too hard a saying for most of us. It's not practical. Everybody has to take thought for tomorrow and calculate. At this point, people can go in two directions. There's one class of people who will say, all right, let's live the uncalculated life. Let's not make any plans. And before you know it, they're living in a filthy pad, bumming around, living on petty thievery and so on. This is the usual thing. They've gotten into it the wrong way. The first thing to do is this: whether you like it or not, and whether you know it or not, the relationship between you and the environment is always one that is harmonious. In the same way, you are always living the uncalculated life. You have to find out, first of all, that you're always doing it, and that what you call your calculations and the things you decided were funny little rationalizations. In other words, your ego has about as much control over what goes on as a child sitting next to its father in a car with a plastic steering wheel, turning the car the way daddy drives it. As I've pointed out, most of the functions, most of the goings-on in you and around you, the circumstances of life, have nothing to do with your ego at all. You don't even know why you make up your mind to do certain things. Superficially, we have a few ideas. It's like when you enter into a marriage, you have really no control over its outcome in the ordinary sense of ego control. You've taken a colossal gamble in which you've involved enormous complexes of patterns. Maybe it'll come out all right if you don't interfere with it too much. It's like Oppenheimer said, it's perfectly obvious that the whole world is going to hell, and the only possible way we might stop that from happening is not to try to prevent it. All these wars are started by people who think that they're helping someone, that it's going to make things better. When you begin from the basis not of saying, I should now live the spontaneous, improvident, non-calculative style of life, but realizing you've always done that, only you rationalize that you didn't. You always did what you wanted to do, basically. Only you said sometimes it was my duty. But you preferred a conception of yourself as someone who always does his duty. That flattered you, and so you were still following your own way. Now, the first thing, then, is to see that that's what's happening, so that you don't think, well, now there is some special thing I have to do to understand this harmonious relationship between the individual and the world. Because if you work on it that way, you will start from the presupposition that that relationship doesn't already exist and has to be brought into being. The thing is, it doesn't have to be brought into being. It's there. But now when you see that that's so, it obviously starts to make a difference. You do behave in a different way. But the new kind of behavior that results from a transformation is not forced behavior. When you try to imitate the way a saint behaves, you have made a forced change. And all forced behavior is phony. It's like someone saying, I love you, I love you, I love you, when you don't. You feel you ought to, but you don't really, and there's something that doesn't ring true. Think of the poor Lord listening to all the prayers of all those people saying, I love you, Jesus, and he knows they don't. They're just saying this because they think they ought to. It must be very trying. Whenever you make a forced change like that, you're working against the grain. If change is to happen, it must happen the same way that a seed, at the proper season, breaks open and sends up a shoot. It comes from the whole force of life itself. When you see that, without your having to do anything, when you see you are living the uncalculated life, and you're only pretending you're calculating it and arranging it, then you will have a grasp of the total situation. You can allow it to produce changes in action which are not forced. This is why there is always a trend in every kind of spiritual doctrine which says something about grace, divine grace. There must come about something in you, some change which you can't produce. And if you try to produce it, you will be a victim of spiritual pride. But, on the other hand, all teachers are universally saying you've got to make an effort. There's some discipline, something you must do. Well, that's the only way to get it across to people, that you, as a separate effort maker, are a myth, a phantasm. Because if you really try to control your mind and only think the thoughts that you think are good thoughts, thoughts you think you should think, you will find that you're going around in a circle. Krishna is awfully good at pointing this out. When people ask him how to meditate, he says, "Why do you want to meditate? Why are you concentrating? Why are you saying prayers? Why do you think you should believe in God?" And it always comes down to, because I'm just a selfish person. I mean, I'm out for my own good, and this seems to be the way. So he says, you see, you don't have any genuine love at all. It's all fake. And so you have to find, first of all, where the genuine love is. Now, you love you, don't you? That's genuine. You won't argue about that. For those wanting to explore how to work practically with these insights about ego, control, and genuine motivation in daily life, I've also created Dialogues with the Unconscious, a 30-day practical guide for applying Jungian psychology through exercises in shadow work, active imagination, and integrating unconscious material. It's not theory, it's application. The link is in the description if this work resonates with you. I gave a talk some time ago to the Air Force at Camp Lab, where they do weapons research. They got a bunch of us there who were ministers and philosophers, and they had the nerve to ask us what was our basis for moral behavior, personal moral behavior. Well, I said my basis for moral behavior is pure selfishness. I'm talking to realistic people here, and I don't think we need to be sentimental and beat about the bush. You're all warriors and fighters and so on, and you know how rough things are. So I'm going to say to you frankly, I'm out for me. But of course I don't do it in a tactless way. I don't go around hitting people over the head saying, "Give me this, give me that." I'm much more subtle. I say, "Good manners, please, and how nice you all are," and so on. And finally, people feel massaged psychologically into the state where they'll give. But then I said, after that, there are some things that bother me. The first one is, if I love me, what do I want? And furthermore, who am I? Because if I'm going to be realistic about getting what I want, I've got to be pretty sure what it is that's me and what is the state of desire in me. If I am desire, if I am a center of desire, what's it all for? I think of all the things I want, but it turns out that none of them are me. I say I want dinner, but that doesn't mean I'm going to eat me up. If I enjoy any pleasure I can think of, it's the enjoyment of something that I hadn't thought of defining as myself. Of course, I like my sensations. I like what happens to my body when I take fine wine and down it. But then what's the difference between my body and the wine? If I say I like the wine, I also mean I like me and the wine together, the mixture. But then I don't eat you, or a friend, or a lover, in the same way as I drink wine. I live in association and enjoy this. But then I'm loving things that aren't formally supposed to be me. As I go into it, in other words, as I investigate what I mean by me, I find that I can't put any limits on it. I cannot experience me without you or without the other. They're inseparable. But you don't find this out until you investigate it, until you really go into the question, what do I want? That's the most important investigation anyone can make. These military men, they think they want power. So I said to them some very subversive and undermining things without anybody knowing it until long after I left. Because when you investigate power, when you investigate what you really want, you discover something extraordinary. The you who wants is inseparable from everything you think you want to possess or control. The distinction between subject and object, between the desirer and the desired, begins to dissolve. And when that dissolution happens, you discover you were never separate from what you were seeking. You were never separate from the power you thought you lacked. You were never separate from the love you thought you needed. The investigation of desire leads inevitably to the discovery that the separate self doing the desiring is itself the fundamental illusion. And when you see through that illusion, not as an idea, but as a lived reality, everything changes. Not because you've achieved something new, but because you've recognized what was always already the case. You are not a separate wave trying to become the ocean. You have always been the ocean, temporarily playing at being a wave. You are not a fragment of the universe trying to reconnect with the whole. You are the whole universe, temporarily pretending to be a fragment. And the entire game of karma, of cause and effect, of what you want and what happens to you, it's all one seamless movement. The inside and the outside moving together, like the two sides of the snake when it swims. When you see this, really see it, the question, what should I do, dissolves. Because there is no separate you to do anything. There is only the total process, expressing itself through this particular form you call yourself. And in that recognition, the burden of effort, the weight of responsibility, the anxiety of control, it all evaporates like morning mist. What remains is not passivity, but spontaneity, not carelessness, but effortless action, not indifference, but a profound intimacy with everything that is. This is what it means to live the uncalculated life, not as something you achieve, but as something you recognize you've been living all along. So here we are at the end of this exploration. We began with a challenging proposition. You always get what you want. Everything that happens to you is your own karma, your own doing. And perhaps now you can see this isn't about blame or about inflating the ego into thinking it controls everything. It's about recognizing that the boundary you've drawn between you and everything else is arbitrary, conceptual, not ultimately real. The ego, that sense of strain, that tightness between the eyes, has about as much control as a child with a plastic steering wheel sitting next to their father in a car. The child turns the wheel and believes they're driving, but the car is going where it's going regardless. The question is not how to gain control. The question is, can you see that you never had it and that this is not a problem but a liberation? Can you see that the calculations you thought you were making were rationalizations after the fact? That the choices you thought you were freely making were expressions of the total situation, not productions of an isolated ego? Can you see that the line between what you do and what happens to you is not a line at all, but a seamless flow? When you see this, when you really see it, you discover you've been living the uncalculated life all along. You've been expressing the Tao, the way of nature, even when you thought you were resisting it. The only difference now is that you know it, and in that knowing, the resistance ceases. The strain dissolves. The effort drops away. What remains is what was always there, life living itself through you, as you, without separation. This is not a state you achieve. It's a recognition of what's always been true. You are the universe. You came out of it like a wave from the ocean, like an apple from the tree. And when you see this, fear dissolves, because you realize you can't fall out of existence. You can only change form. So investigate. Investigate what you really want. Investigate who you really are. And in that investigation, you may discover that the searcher and the sought are one and the same. Thank you for walking this path with me today. If these explorations have resonated with you, subscribe to this channel for more philosophical and psychological depth. Share this with someone who might need to hear it. Leave your reflections in the comments. I genuinely want to know how these ideas land with you. For those ready to go deeper, check out Beyond the Shadow for understanding Jung's core psychological framework, and Dialogues with the Unconscious for practical 30-day exercises in Jungian psychology. Links are in the description. Remember, you are not trying to gain control. You are recognizing you never had it, and that this is liberation, not loss. Until next time, keep investigating, keep seeing, keep being.